In this week's Motor Week, Richard Hammond drives the ultimate Lotus, the Esprit 350S. Chris Goffey investigates the Rover BRM, and Ginny Buckley drives the Jeep Grand Cherokee both on and off-road. But first, a TV exclusive, the UK's first drive of one of the most bizarre and revolutionary vehicles to be built for production. It won't be on sale here till next year. But now, Ken Gibson reports on our exclusive Motor Week lead story.
Ever imagined a family car that gets you more attention than a Ferrari supercar? Impossible? Well, meet the Multipla. The instant reaction to Fiat's new Multipla is shocking, weird, wacky, and ugly. It is a car that is absolutely impossible to ignore, and believe me, nobody does.
Well, I saw as I pulled onto the car park here from the outside, and I thought it was rather ugly looking, particularly from the front. It was very unusual shaped, also like a fold of flesh over the bonnet, a bit like a boxer dog from the front. The interior is very impressive. There's loads of space. I particularly like the central pod here. Does that? I don't suppose that turns to face this way at all, does it?
No, it doesn't move. It's actually.
Yeah, it's. The gear stick here, leaving all the space there in the centre of the floor, is a nice touch as well.
I think it will take off because the seats are very, very comfortable, considering it's a six-seater car. Because sometimes if you sat in the back of like my Peugeot saloon and there's three of you, you're all bunched up together, but you've got three actual seats in the back and three in the front. So I think it will take off for a family car.
Fiat believe we're changing the way that we look at cars. We're no longer apparently looking at them as style objects or status symbols. They actually say that what we're looking for now is an everyday tool that's functional, but also gives you plenty of scope for pleasure. So having accepted that the whole world will be looking at you, what's it actually like to drive? First impressions are very lively. And that's an even bigger impression when you realise it's a 1.9 diesel. Fiat have spent an awful lot of time on soundproofing on the Multipla, and it shows. This is a very quiet vehicle. As soon as you've got it running, you would not believe you're in a diesel. One of the key unusual areas, of course, is the gear stick here mounted on the dash. That's because of the three-seat configuration, so you've got plenty of room for the extra passenger in the front. And the other thing that strikes you is how airy the cabin is and how great the visibility is. You've got huge sweeping windows to the front and to the side. Although I found one problem with the window over the days I was driving, it collects flies like nothing you've ever seen. The other thing that you quickly notice is how easy and relaxing the Multipla is to drive. The controls, they look a bit bizarre when you first see them here. This huge pod sticking out, but they're actually very functional. You've got one main speedometer straight just to the right of you here, which has got everything you need on it. All the dials are easy to hand, to touch, and it really is a very practical machine. The other great thing about the Multipla is it's what we call in the trade a grower. Everyone who's seen it, after the initial gasp and shock and saying that's terrible, or God, what does that look like? By the end of a journey in it, they'll love it. I had one friend, a New Zealand aficionado of cars, and he thought it was dreadful at first. At the end of the day, he was raving about it. How comfortable it was, how he liked the very fresh, different interior. Fiat are aiming the Multipla directly at Renault's hugely successful Scenic in the mini people carrier sector. So how practical is it? 6 seats, 3 in the front, 3 in the back. The middle one in the front is excellent because it actually eases just back from the driver and the other passenger, so you don't have any clash with the driver. It also folds down and turns into a mini table if there's no passenger, which is, again, very functional. In the back, all 3 seats will actually come out. You can also lay all 3 of them flat, and they also can move forward slightly so that you can have the option of more luggage space or more passenger space.
It seems to be very versatile. The 3 seats across the front as opposed to just a bench seat or whatever, particularly like this one with folding down to provide a table and drink space if you've got kiddies in the back. It's for the side. It doesn't look that large from the outside, but see, it can quite easily fit 6 people inside. It should be. I'd love to have a go any chance, you know.
But I don't think it's a very nice looking car, to be quite truthful. But I think it's practical for a large family, and storage as well, which is obviously with pushchairs and prams and car seats and things. I think it is a family car.
So, the million-dollar question, will it sell? Well, it doesn't come on sale in the UK until January of next year, but it's been on sale for 3 months in Italy and 2 other countries in Europe, and Fiat have sold 30,000. Now, the fact that Fiat didn't expect to sell any more than 40,000 in an entire year confirms maybe that they were as unsure as the rest of us as to just how well such an extreme vehicle would sell. But clearly, it's got an awful lot of potential, and the public appear, if not exactly to love it, to be intrigued enough to buy it.
Has anybody seen a rather bemused looking female with a very long scarf? God, I've lost her and the scarf this time. Time travel. If you were to travel back through time and motoring history, there would be certain shapes of cars that you would see had remained constant over the decades. I'm thinking particularly about the Porsche 911, a Germanic supercar of some repute, the profile of which has barely changed for decades. Well, here's another one, and it's another supercar, and the good news is, it's a British one. The Lotus Esprit, this wedge shape with its angles and lines, really has barely changed, though they might tell you that it has, over several decades. You don't have to be a motoring aficionado to recognise the shape of the Esprit. They've barely changed it. They've rounded off the odd corner, but that's it. It still has that steeply raked windscreen and bonnet, familiar stuff. If you think this Esprit looks a little more aggressive than most, that's because, well, it is. It's the 350 Sport, a version designed especially for owners who want to take their Esprits to track days and competitive use. To that end, it has this enormous rear spoiler that I think looks fantastic. It's made of lightweight carbon fibre and these milled aluminium struts. It's the real thing. Keeping the front in order, there's an enormous front spoiler and a specially modified splitter. Not a difficult car to recognise, particularly when you realise it has, well, 350 Sport written all down the side, which helps. But the 350 Sport is about more than changes to the surface. There are enhancements underneath the surface as well. The suspension has been uprated, the brakes uprated, and there have been a few changes to the engine. Inside the cockpit, it's familiar territory for anybody who's ever sat inside an Esprit. Very familiar. It's barely changed. They did introduce the centre console for the '98 motor show and the cowling over the instruments. Other than that, it's all pretty well laid out. There's nothing exceptional about the interior here, but then that's not the idea. The idea of the Esprit is that you drive it, fire up the V8 and, well, I guess enjoy yourself is the only way I can describe it. Shades a must, obviously. Lotus still produce a 2-litre 4-cylinder engine which harks back to the original Esprits, but most Esprits nowadays, including this one, are a V8. It's a 3.5-litre unit, 350 brake horsepower, hence the Sport 350, and what a fantastic unit it is too. It's been subtly re-engineered in this one, just tweaks here and there to change the torque curve so it's more low-down power, which is fantastic for use on track days, which is where a car like this is going to earn its keep. And those all-important figures, well, 0 to 60 time is 4.7 seconds, more than respectable. 0 to 100 is what most cars will struggle to do 60 in 10.6 seconds. Onto a top speed limited to 175 miles an hour, which is more than fast enough, even on the track. As a drive, predictably, it is fantastic. If Lotus can do one thing better than anybody else, it's set up a car to maximise that compromise between stiffness and livability. It handles incredibly well, neutral balance thanks to its mid-engine layout, enormous amounts of grip from those huge tyres, even with 350 brake horsepower pumping out through the rear wheels. Bearing in mind, of course, this is a supercar. It's an awful lot of power, it's an awful lot of car, it's quite a daunting prospect. I'm not going to say it's an absolute pussycat on the road. Visibility is hampered a little bit, but at the same time, there's no need to be that frightened of it. It is eminently drivable and it will happily plod along the country lanes, just making it look good, really. This car does make you feel like James Bond with a long, low driving position. You do want to wear a dinner suit. No doubt about it. Yes, Miss Moneypenny. Is this car not having an effect on your nickel elastic? He was Irish, you know, James Bond. Definitely. Typical, isn't it? The Germans get nothing but praise for the fact that the Porsche 911 has stayed more or less the same shape decade after decade. And yet the Lotus Esprit has been criticised in the past for looking a little bit, well, dated. So I get a lot of satisfaction from the fact that now with Ford and their new edge design, the straight lines of the Lotus Esprit are like kipper ties and flared trousers, having their turn at coming back into fashion. You might call it old edge design. And I like that fact. Makes me happy.
Most manufacturers just sell cars, but not a manufacturer like Jeep. They do much more than provide you with 4 wheels to get you from A to B. When you buy a Jeep, you buy a whole lifestyle as well. Now, you may live in a semi in Croydon, but having one of these parts in your driveway makes you feel a little bit more adventurous. I reckon that if John Wayne could have got down off his horse, then this would have been the kind of car he chose to drive. So I imagine that the designers at Jeep realised they had a huge act to follow when they sat down to work on the new version. New version, I hear you ask? Well, that's actually what this is. It may not look like it, but it is the all-new Jeep Grand Cherokee 1999. Even though there aren't enormous changes in styling, don't think for 1 minute that this is just a revamp. There are actually only 127 parts carried over on this version from the old. Most of those are just nuts and bolts, the largest of which is the oil filter on this 4-litre version. Now, the Grand Cherokee sits on the same wheelbase as the old model, but it's a much bigger vehicle. It's 110mm longer, 54mm wider and 30mm higher. But even though it's grown in every direction, it's not a huge hike to get into it. All you need is one dainty little step and you're in. As soon as you get inside the cabin, you notice the feeling of quality. You sink into really comfortable leather seats. Everything feels very refined and it's very well made. If gadgets are the thing that do it for you, then there are plenty of them in here. There's electric everything. There's a great stereo, dual air conditioning, and my favourite, heated seats for those cold winter mornings. Now, I've got to say there's also plenty of space. There's lots of headroom and there's certainly enough legroom for the driver and the passengers. And if you work your way around to the back, you'll see the load area is now bigger than it used to be. That's because that huge spare tyre now lives underneath the cargo floor instead of taking up valuable space. Now, improvements, as we all know, cost money. So how many more pennies are you going to have to pay to get behind the wheel of the all-new improved Grand Cherokee? Well, the answer is actually not 1 penny more. That's because this 4-litre Limited is exactly the same price as the version it replaces. That's just under £30,000. Perhaps the Chancellor, Mr Brown, could do with a few lessons in reducing inflation from the chaps at Chrysler Jeep. The old Grand Cherokee was one of those cars that I couldn't ever imagine getting any better. That was until I drove the new version. It really is so impressive. It's refined and it's luxurious, and it's almost hard to imagine it doing all those adventurous things that the Jeep is so well known for. So, because it's gone all comfortable and civilised, does that mean it's gone a little bit soft around the edges? Well, I'll be finding out in the wilds of Scotland right after the break. It's all very well producing an off-roader that looks the part, But if in reality it's nothing more than a King's Road cruiser that won't even cut through the skin of your custard, then what's the point? But if you've got this badge on the front of your 4x4, it's a pretty safe bet that you can get into some serious mischief in it, particularly when you've got the whole of the Scottish Highlands to go at. Well, I've got my Grand Cherokee, it's got all the technology and it's time to put it to the test. There's an off-road course in the Scottish Highlands waiting for me. But before I put a £30,000 brand new vehicle through that, maybe I should get a few tips from the experts first.
Well, the first tip is to be very careful. We're going to be driving through some very narrow sections of road. We've got some steep uphills and downhills. And obviously with a vehicle like this, you've got a lot of power there, a lot of traction, especially with the new quad drive system. So you do need to be careful.
Well, it sounds like the Cherokee is certainly up for it. I suppose it's time to see if I can handle it. One of the rules in off-roading is that when you go down a hill, you don't use the brakes. They're very strict on this. However, this hill is so bad that they've told us we have to use the brakes this time. Can't wait for this one.
I can't believe we're going to go down that. We're going to go straight into the lock. I must be mad. Oh! Oh, God, have you seen that thing go?
Well, it was a struggle to get up here, but once you're at the top, I've got to say the views are absolutely spectacular. And I've just learnt a survival tip. If you get stranded in the wilderness without any toilet paper, just grab a handful of moss. That was absolutely amazing. I've had such a good time up there. And I'd like to say that it's my driving skill that's got me through it all. But I've got to be honest and say that when you're in a vehicle like the new Grand Cherokee, all you really need to do is put your trust in the vehicle and just keep an eye on where you're going. This is just so competent. Now, I know that 93% of off-roaders never see more than the odd trundle up a country lane or maybe the school run. But if you fancy finding out what an off-roader can really do, then I can report that the Grand Cherokee performs as well on-road as it does off. Go on, go and find yourself some mud. You don't know what you're missing.
Some of the greatest names in motor racing have driven these cars, the BRMs, from their very start. They provided some of the high spots and some of the disasters of British motor racing. And now there's a new car to bear the name. So here it is, the Rover BRM200. We first saw it at the Frankfurt show last year as a styling exercise, but Rover obviously thought there was more mileage in it than that, because they've decided to go ahead and build 750 examples. And no, it's not going to be another Renault Williams. They actually say even if they sell the lot, they're not going to make any more. So, given that the Rover BRM costs over £1,000 more than the equivalent 216 three-door, what do you get for your money? First and most obviously, this interior modelled on racing car themes, with padded quilting on the transmission tunnel and on the sills and up here on the sides of the doors, aluminium turn surrounds to loudspeakers and gear lever, and on the dashboard and down here on the transmission tunnel. Could easily have looked very tacky, but Rover have done a very good job. But Rover are pushing this as a sporting package, a real driver's car, and you can't do that just by changing the interior trim. In fact, the engine's exactly the same. It's the MGF VVC unit, 145 brake horsepower, but they've changed the gear ratio, so as you go up through the box, it's always boiling away over 4,000 RPM. They put in a Torsen limited slip differential as well to try and keep down wheel spin to a minimum. And they played around with the suspension settings and the dampers as well to give a sharper and more controlled ride. The car sits on big fat alloy wheels which look very much like the old Mini lights, and they're shod with directional Dunlop 205 tyres. What's the result of all this? Let's find out. Well, it certainly does go 0 to 60 in 7.9 seconds and a maximum of 127 miles an hour claimed by Rover. And out here on the tarmac expanses of the old Melbourne Loop at Donington Racetrack, well, you can throw this little car around to your heart's content. I don't know, I must be getting seriously out of touch with new car values. Rover executives assure me that this car is quite competitive against other sporty offerings from other manufacturers, but 18,000 quid still seems an awful lot of money to me for a three-door hatchback. That said, it's great to see the BRM name still alive, and if you want to join an extremely exclusive club, the people who've actually driven BRMs, then get your name down for one of these quick.